Margaret stood in the front room of her old family home, gazing at the wooden beams that stretched across the ceiling like protective arms. The house was her sanctuary, a cocoon of memories, especially those tied to her late husband, Robert. Every corner, from the porch where they'd shared morning coffee to the living room where they'd sat together on cold winter nights, was filled with the quiet hum of the life they had built. Now, it was just her and the house. Margaret's days revolved around keeping the house in perfect order. It was her way of honoring Robert's memory and maintaining a connection to the life they'd shared. Her greatest joy, though, came from her daughter Zoe, who had recently married Dexter. Zoe was her world, and Margaret had always hoped she would find a love as deep and true as the one she had known. Dexter seemed like the perfect match for her daughter, charming, attentive, and ambitious. In the months following their wedding, Zoe and Dexter began visiting Margaret more often, something that initially filled her heart with happiness. At first, the visits felt like a blessing. Dexter was polite, always full of compliments about Margaret's home. He admired the old wooden floors, the brick fireplace, and the garden that bloomed with roses in the summer. His comments, initially flattering, slowly began to shift in tone. He started discussing the future, musing aloud about how the house would be perfect for a young, growing family. He never said it directly, but Margaret noticed the subtle shift in his language. "When Zoe and I have children, this house would be such a great place for them to grow up," he remarked one evening, his eyes lingering on the sturdy walls that had stood for decades. Margaret, at first, dismissed these remarks as harmless. Dexter was simply thinking ahead, wasn't he? Young people often dreamed about their futures, and perhaps he was just fantasizing about the idea of having a family. Yet, over time, these comments became more frequent, more deliberate. One day, as Margaret prepared tea in the kitchen, she overheard a conversation that made her heart freeze. Dexter was on the phone with his mother, Loretta, his voice barely a whisper but clear enough for Margaret to hear every word. "The house is just too big for her, don't you think?" Dexter said, his tone nonchalant. "It would be much better for Zoe and me. Once we have kids, we'll need the space, and Margaret could easily move into a smaller apartment. It'd be easier for her, and honestly, it's time she lets go of the past." Margaret's hand tightened around the teapot handle, the clink of china as she set it down, the only sound in the now suffocating quiet. Her throat constricted as the realization washed over her. Dexter wasn't just admiring the house, he wanted it. Worse, he was plotting behind her back to convince Zoe of the same. The betrayal was sharp. Margaret had welcomed Dexter into her family, trusted him to care for her daughter, and now, it seemed, he was plotting to take the one thing she cherished most, her home. The house, where every piece of furniture, every crack in the walls, held memories of her life with Robert. How could he be so callous? Her immediate impulse was to confront Zoe. She needed to know what was happening, to understand if her daughter was complicit in Dexter's schemes. That evening, she invited Zoe over, deciding to speak calmly, hoping that perhaps it was all a misunderstanding. "Zoe, honey, can we talk?" Margaret began cautiously as they sat at the kitchen table, the familiar warmth of the space doing little to calm her nerves. "I overheard a conversation between Dexter and his mother about the house." Zoe's brow furrowed, her usual bright expression dimming with confusion. "What do you mean, Mom?" Margaret hesitated, searching for the right words. "Dexter mentioned that this house would be better suited for you and him. He said I should move into a smaller place, something more manageable. I need to know if you've talked about this." Zoe's eyes widened in surprise. "What? No, Mom, that's not. Dexter probably didn't mean it like that. He's been talking a lot about the future lately. I think he's just planning ahead for when we have kids." Margaret sighed, her chest heavy. "I heard him, Zoe. He was talking to his mother about how the house is too big for me, about how you two could live here. It wasn't just planning ahead, it sounded like he was serious." Zoe frowned, her gaze shifting to the floor. I'm sure he didn't mean any harm, Mom. He's just practical, you know? He's been really focused on our future. Margaret wanted to believe her daughter. She wanted to trust that Dexter's words were simply a miscommunication, but a knot of doubt tightened in her stomach. She looked at Zoe, her beautiful daughter, who was trying so hard to smooth things over. I hope you're right, Margaret said softly. I just want to make sure you understand that this house means everything to me. It's not just a place to live, it's my history, my life with your father. Zoe reached across the table and squeezed her mother's hand. I understand, Mom. I'll talk to Dexter. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. But as Zoe left that evening, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was brewing. Dexter's intentions, once hidden behind his charming smile, were slowly unraveling before her. She feared that this was only the beginning of a struggle she never thought she'd face, with her own family. A week had passed since Margaret's conversation with Zoe, and despite her daughter's assurances, the uneasy feeling lingered. Margaret tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on the simple routines of her life, tending to the garden, cleaning the house, and reading in the late afternoons by the large bay window. But Dexter's words, the way he had so casually discussed her home as if it were already his, gnawed her. The house, once her sanctuary, now felt fragile, as though it were slipping from her grasp. Margaret noticed a change in Zoe's behavior, too. She didn't visit as often, and when she did, there was a tension in her demeanor. Zoe seemed torn between wanting to reassure her mother and defending Dexter. Their conversations, once effortless, now felt stilted and awkward. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something unspoken was hanging between them. One afternoon, while Margaret was sweeping the front porch, she saw Zoe's car pull into the driveway. Her heart lightened briefly, hoping that Zoe was there for a simple mother-daughter visit, something to restore the easy warmth between them. Hey, Mom, Zoe said, stepping out of the car. She gave her mother a quick hug, but there was a nervous energy about her, and Margaret could feel it. Hi, sweetheart. I didn't expect you today, Margaret replied, trying to keep her tone light. Zoe smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. I thought we could talk, you know, about what you mentioned the other day. Margaret's heart sank. She had hoped Zoe would have sorted things out, that maybe this visit would be about anything but Dexter. Of course. Let's sit down, they settled at the kitchen table, where countless conversations had unfolded over the years, from childhood dilemmas to wedding plans. But today, the air was heavy with anticipation. Mom, Zoe began, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her sweater, I talked to Dexter, like I promised. He was really upset that you thought he wanted the house. He didn't mean it like that, Margaret nodded slowly, but the knot in her stomach tightened. What did he say, exactly? Zoe sighed. He said he's just worried about you. He thinks the house is too much for you to manage on your own, and he was only thinking about how to make things easier for you. He's not trying to take it from you, Mom. The explanation sounded rehearsed, as if Dexter had carefully coached Zoe on what to say. Margaret's chest ached at the thought of her daughter caught in the middle of this, but she knew there was more to it. Zoe, this isn't just about the house being too much for me. Dexter said he wanted the house for you too, for when you have children. He was already talking to Loretta about it, planning as if this place is his. Zoe's expression flickered with uncertainty, and Margaret could see the conflict in her daughter's eyes. He's just being practical. We have a small apartment, and, well, we've been talking about the future a lot lately. I think Dexter just got ahead of himself. Margaret leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. Zoe, I understand thinking about the future. But this house is my life. It's the only thing I have left of your father, of all the memories we shared together. It's not just a building. It's my home. Zoe's eyes softened, and for a moment, Margaret thought she might break through to her. But then Zoe straightened, her resolve seemingly returning. Mom, I get that. I do. But Dexter and I were thinking about starting a family soon. And, honestly, this house is perfect for raising kids. It's got space, a yard, everything we need. Margaret felt her breath catch. There it was, the truth. Zoe had already started thinking about this house as her future home, guided by Dexter's ambitions. The disappointment hit Margaret like a wave, and she had to steady herself before speaking. I never imagined I'd have to fight for my own home, especially not against my own family, Margaret said softly, her voice laced with hurt. I've given you everything, Zoe. I want you to have a beautiful life, but not like this. You can't take away the one place that's kept me grounded after your father died. Zoe bit her lip, her defenses faltering. We're not trying to take anything from you, Mom. Dexter just thinks you'd be more comfortable somewhere smaller, somewhere easier to take care of. Margaret shook her head. Don't you see, Zoe? That's not his decision to make. It's mine. And I'm not ready to leave this house. Not now, not ever. The tension between them was palpable, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Margaret could see the conflict in Zoe's eyes, the pull between her loyalty to her mother and her desire to build a life with Dexter. Zoe stood up suddenly, breaking the silence. Mom, I love you. I don't want this to come between us. But I also have to think about my own family, my future with Dexter. Margaret's heart broke as she watched Zoe turn and walk toward the door, her steps heavy with indecision. She wanted to reach out, to tell her daughter that everything would be fine, that they could work it out. But how could they, when Dexter was already planting seeds of doubt and division? As the door closed behind Zoe, the house felt emptier than it had in years. Margaret sat in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She realized that this wasn't just about a house, it was about control, about Dexter's growing influence over Zoe and his thinly veiled desire for the life Margaret had built. The sharp pang of betrayal mixed with a growing sense of resolve. Margaret knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. Dexter wasn't going to stop, and if Zoe wasn't fully aware of his intentions, then Margaret would have to make her see. She would have to confront Dexter, directly and without hesitation. And Margaret, who had lived through so much already, was not about to let her home, her memories, and her independence be stolen by a man she had once trusted. As she stood in the quiet house, Margaret knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning. The battle for her home had just begun. The tension between Margaret and Zoe lingered like a dark cloud. Weeks passed with only brief, strained visits from Zoe, and Dexter's presence, once friendly and light-hearted, now felt ominous. His casual remarks about the house persisted, growing more pointed. Margaret couldn't ignore the veiled suggestions anymore. Dexter was circling her, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. One evening, Margaret sat alone in the living room, the crackling of the fireplace the only sound breaking the silence. She stared into the flames, her mind churning over the events of the past few weeks. She knew she had to confront Dexter directly, but every time she imagined it, the thought of losing Zoe to his manipulations terrified her. Still, the house, this home, was worth fighting for. The decision came unexpectedly one afternoon when Dexter showed up unannounced, smiling as if nothing were wrong. Margaret was in the garden, pruning her beloved roses, when she saw his car pull up. She wiped her hands on her apron, feeling a wave of resolve wash over her. Margaret, Dexter called as he walked up the path, his smile wide and confident. I thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing. Zoe's working late tonight, so I figured I'd check on you. Margaret forced a smile, the warmth that once accompanied their interactions replaced with wariness. I'm fine, Dexter. Just keeping busy in the garden. You're always keeping this place beautiful, he remarked, glancing at the house. I've always admired how well you've maintained it all these years. Margaret set her pruning shears down on the garden bench, folding her arms. I do my best. It's important to me, Dexter nodded, stepping closer, his eyes drifting to the house. You know, Margaret, Zoe and I have been talking more about the future, about starting a family. This place, it's perfect for that. All this space, the garden, the rooms upstairs, Margaret's patience snapped. She had listened to enough of his subtle hints, enough of his plans that excluded her without ever truly saying it. This time, she wouldn't let him dance around the issue. "Dexter," she interrupted, her voice firmer than she expected. "I know exactly what you're getting at. You've been making comments about this house since the day you married Zoe, and I've tried to be understanding, but this is going too far." Dexter blinked, his charming smile faltering for a brief second before he recovered. "Margaret, I think you're misunderstanding." "No, I'm not," Margaret cut in, stepping forward. "You're trying to get me out of this house. You've been pushing Zoe, trying to convince her that this is the best place for you two to raise a family, but let me be clear, it's not going to happen." The shock on Dexter's face was palpable, but his recovery was swift. "Margaret, that's not fair. I've only ever wanted what's best for you. This house is too much for you to take care of alone. That's not your decision to make," Margaret snapped, her voice rising as years of suppressed emotions came flooding to the surface. "This house is all I have left of Robert, of the life we built together. You don't get to come in here, act like the perfect son-in-law, and then plot to take it away from me." "I heard you, Dexter. I heard what you said to your mother, how you think this house should be yours." The color drained from Dexter's face for a moment, and Margaret saw the flicker of anger flash in his eyes. His facade of concern cracked just slightly, enough to reveal the real man underneath. "You overheard that?" he asked, his voice lower, tighter. "Margaret, you don't understand. I'm thinking about the future. Zoe and I need a place like this for our family." "It's just practical for you," Margaret countered, her heart pounding in her chest. "You've been manipulating Zoe, twisting this idea of practicality to suit your own selfish plans. But this house, my home, isn't just a piece of property you can decide is yours. It's where I belong. And I'm not leaving." Dexter's jaw clenched, the mask of charm slipping even further. "You're clinging to the past, Margaret. It's not healthy. You'd be better off in a smaller place, somewhere easier for you to manage. Zoe and I are the future. You need to start thinking about what's best for everyone, not just yourself." The words stung, but they also ignited something in Margaret, an anger she hadn't felt in years. She stood tall, her voice unwavering. "I'm thinking about what's best for me, Dexter. And that means staying here, in my home. If you think you can bully me into leaving, you're wrong." For a moment, they stood in tense silence, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Margaret could see the frustration in Dexter's eyes, how much he had invested in this plan, how badly he wanted to win. But she was not the fragile woman he had imagined. "You're making a mistake," Dexter said finally, his voice laced with warning. "This house will be too much for you, Margaret. Sooner or later, you'll have to leave. And when that time comes, Zoe and I will be ready to step in." The audacity of his words left Margaret speechless, but only for a moment. She narrowed her eyes, her voice calm and deliberate. "If that time ever comes, Dexter, it won't be because you pushed me out. And if you think Zoe is going to stand by you through this, well, you don't know her as well as you think." Dexter opened his mouth to reply, but the sudden sound of a car pulling into the driveway silenced him. Margaret turned to see Zoe's car coming to a stop. The moment had arrived sooner than she had anticipated. This confrontation was no longer just between her and Dexter. Zoe was about to walk into the middle of it. As Zoe stepped out of the car, her expression shifted from confusion to concern as she saw her mother and husband standing in the garden, the tension between them unmistakable. "Mom? Dexter? What's going on?" Margaret took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared for what was to come. Zoe needed to know the truth, and Margaret could only hope that her daughter would finally see what was happening. "We need to talk, Zoe," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "It's time you knew exactly what's been going on." Zoe looked between them, her face tightening with anxiety. What do you mean? What's going on? Margaret glanced at Dexter, who remained silent, his jaw clenched, before turning back to her daughter. Dexter's been pushing to take this house from me, Zoe. He's been talking about how I should move out, how this place would be better for the two of you. I overheard him planning this with his mother. Zoe's eyes widened, disbelief spreading across her face. She turned to Dexter. Is this true? Were you planning behind my back? Dexter's face contorted as he scrambled to regain control of the situation. Zoe, I didn't mean it like that. I was thinking about our future, about what's best for us as a family. You know how much this house would mean to us, but not at the cost of my mother's home, Zoe cried, stepping back from him. You've been doing all this without telling me, trying to force my mom out. That's not what we agreed to, Dexter. Margaret watched the realization dawn on Zoe's face, the shock turning to anger. Her daughter had finally seen through Dexter's charm, seen the calculating side of him that had been hidden for so long. Dexter reached out for Zoe, but she stepped further away, her eyes filled with hurt and betrayal. Zoe, I was trying to make things better for us. I was thinking about us. Zoe shook her head, her voice trembling. This wasn't about us. This was about you trying to control everything. I can't believe you'd do this. Margaret's heart ached as she watched her daughter, torn between her love for Dexter and her loyalty to her mother. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Zoe was beginning to see the truth. The battle for the house was far from over, but Margaret knew one thing for certain: she wasn't fighting alone anymore. Zoe stood frozen in the garden, caught between her mother's revelation and Dexter's desperate explanations. Margaret could see the struggle in her daughter's eyes, the painful process of realizing that the man she had married might not be the person she thought he was. Zoe, Dexter's voice softened as he took a step toward her, his hand reaching out. You have to believe me. I was only thinking about our future. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, especially your mom. I just wanted what was best for us. Zoe turned her head slightly, avoiding his touch, the pain in her eyes now replaced by something deeper, a growing distrust. But you didn't talk to me, Dexter. You made these plans behind my back. If you really wanted what was best for us, why didn't you tell me? Why go behind my mom's back? I feel like I don't even know you right now. Margaret's heart twisted as she watched her daughter, knowing that this moment was shattering the perfect image Zoe had built of her life with Dexter. She didn't want to see Zoe hurt, but she also knew the truth had to come out, no matter how painful it might be. I didn't think I needed to burden you with it, Dexter said, his voice pleading. I was going to tell you, but I wanted to figure out the details first. Margaret can't stay in that house forever. We both know it's too much for her. I was trying to take care of things for you. For me? Zoe's voice cracked. Or for yourselves? The question hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Dexter faltered, his usual confidence crumbling as he realized that Zoe wasn't going to be as easily swayed this time. Margaret could see his frustration building, the mask of charm he always wore slipping as he struggled to maintain control. Zoe, you need to understand that this is practical, Dexter said, his tone hardening slightly. Your mom is living in a house that's too big for her. It's going to become a burden, and when we have kids, we'll need more space. I'm thinking ahead. That's not wrong, it's responsible. Zoe took a step back, shaking her head as if trying to clear the fog that had settled over her. But you didn't give me a choice. You decided for me. You decided for my mom. That's not being responsible, Dexter, that's controlling. Margaret felt a swell of pride as she watched Zoe begin to push back, to see through the web that Dexter had spun around her. But the pain in Zoe's voice was unmistakable. She had loved Dexter, trusted him, and now that trust was unraveling in front of them. Dexter's jaw clenched, the frustration in his eyes flashing with something darker. I wasn't trying to control you, Zoe. I was trying to protect you. I wanted to make sure we were set up for the future. And what about my mom's future? Zoe shot back, her voice rising. She's not ready to leave this house. It's her home. It's where she built her life with my dad. How could you think it's okay to just push her out? For a moment, Dexter seemed at a loss for words. He glanced toward Margaret, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly, as if he blamed her for this confrontation. Margaret, you know I'm just trying to do what's best for everyone. Margaret stood tall, refusing to be cowed by his attempt to regain control of the conversation. You're doing what's best for yourself, Dexter. Don't pretend this is about anything else. This house isn't a burden to me. It's where I belong. And I won't be forced out of it, not by you or anyone. Zoe looked at her mother, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. She knew Margaret was right, but accepting that meant facing the fact that Dexter had been manipulating her, slowly but surely, since the beginning. Zoe turned back to Dexter, her face pale with realization. You've been pushing this idea since we got married, haven't you? She whispered. All those little comments about the house, about how much space we'd need, was it all just part of your plan? Dexter's eyes flickered with irritation, his control slipping even further. Zoe, it's not like that. You're blowing this out of proportion. No, Zoe said, her voice firmer now. I'm not. I've been blind to what's been happening, but now I see it. You weren't just thinking about us, you were thinking about yourself, about what you wanted. And you didn't care how it would affect my mom or me. The silence that followed was thick, as if the very air around them had frozen. Dexter's face tightened, and Margaret could see that he was on the verge of losing his temper completely. For the first time, she saw the true depth of his character, the entitlement, the need for control, the disregard for anything that stood in his way. Zoe, you're making a mistake, Dexter said, his voice lower now, more threatening. I've done everything for us, for our future. If you can't see that, then maybe you're not ready to be a part of it. Margaret's blood ran cold at the thinly veiled threat in his words. She had feared this moment, feared what Dexter might do if he didn't get his way. But now, watching him turn on Zoe, she knew this was no longer just about the house. This was about power, control, and Dexter's belief that he could manipulate the people around him to fit into the future he wanted. Zoe stared at him, her face a mask of disbelief. Are you threatening me, Dexter? Dexter's expression shifted, his mask of charm snapping back into place, but the damage was done. The crack in his facade was wide enough for both Margaret and Zoe to see through now. No, of course not. I'm just saying we need to think about what's best for us, for our future. But Zoe wasn't fooled. She took a step back, her hand instinctively moving toward her mother as if seeking support. I need time to think, Dexter. I can't just ignore everything that's happened. Dexter's face hardened. You need time? What does that mean, Zoe? Zoe took a deep breath, her voice trembling but resolute. It means I'm staying here for a while. I need to think about what I want, about what's really best for me. Right now, I don't know if I can trust you. The words hit Dexter like a slap, and for a moment, Margaret feared he might lash out. But instead, he just stared at Zoe, his eyes cold and calculating. Fine, he said at last, his voice clipped. Take all the time you need. But don't expect me to wait forever. With that, Dexter turned on his heel and strode toward his car, his footsteps heavy with anger. He didn't look back as he slammed the car door and sped down the driveway, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Margaret exhaled, the tension in her body finally releasing as she watched Dexter's car disappear down the road. She turned to Zoe, who stood there, trembling, her face pale with the weight of everything that had just happened. Oh, Mom, Zoe whispered, her voice breaking as she collapsed into Margaret's arms. I didn't see it. I didn't realize. Margaret held her daughter close, her heart breaking for the pain Zoe was feeling. It's okay, sweetheart. You see it now, and that's what matters. Zoe pulled back, wiping tears from her eyes. I'm so sorry, Mom. I didn't want to believe that Dexter could do something like this. I thought he was just thinking about our future, but he was controlling everything. Margaret stroked her daughter's hair, her own heart heavy with the bittersweetness of the moment. You don't have to apologize, Zoe. You trusted him because you loved him. But now you see the truth. That's all that matters. Zoe nodded, but the weight of her realization was still fresh, still raw. What do I do now? I don't know if I can go back to him. Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand. You take your time. Don't rush into anything. And remember, no matter what happens, this house will always be your home too. Zoe smiled weakly through her tears, the love between them unspoken but understood. The battle for the house might not be over, but in this moment, they had won something far more important, a renewed bond built on trust, love, and the strength to stand up for what truly mattered. And in the distance, the storm that was Dexter simmered, waiting for its next move. In the weeks that followed, the house stood in quiet defiance against the storm that had swept through their lives. Dexter was gone, but his shadow still lingered. Zoe stayed with Margaret during this time, filling the once empty rooms with her presence, but there was a heaviness to their days, a silence that both women struggled to break as they grappled with what came next. Zoe avoided Dexter's calls at first, but they grew more frequent, more desperate, until one day she picked up, ready to face what she had been avoiding. Dexter, she said, her voice steady, though her hand trembled as she gripped the phone. We need to talk. On the other end, Dexter's voice softened, full of that old charm she had once loved. Zoe, I've been trying to reach you. We can work this out. We just had a misunderstanding. Come home, and we'll figure this out together. Zoe hesitated, glancing toward the window where Margaret was tending to the roses, as if seeking strength from the woman who had shown her the truth. No, Dexter. I need you to understand something. This wasn't a misunderstanding. What you did, planning behind my back, trying to push my mom out of her home, it wasn't right. You didn't just cross a line, you broke my trust. There was silence on the other end, the weight of her words settling in. Zoe, I was thinking about us, Dexter replied, his voice tighter now, more controlled. I'm sorry if you feel like I went about it the wrong way, but everything I did was for our future. You have to believe that. Zoe closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. It doesn't matter why you did it, Dexter. What matters is that you didn't include me in the decision. You didn't respect my mom, and you didn't respect me. I can't be with someone who thinks they know better than me, who manipulates and controls. That's not love. A long pause stretched between them, and Zoe could hear Dexter's frustration building, his control slipping once again. So that's it? You're just going to throw everything away because I tried to secure our future? You're making a huge mistake, Zoe. Zoe shook her head, feeling the finality of it all settle into her bones. No, Dexter. The mistake was thinking you could control me. I'm done. She ended the call before Dexter could say anything more, her hand shaking as she set the phone down. A sense of relief washed over her, though it was tinged with sadness. She had loved Dexter once, truly believed in their future together, but that future had been built on lies and control. Now, she was free. That evening, Zoe sat with Margaret at the kitchen table, the warmth of the familiar room offering a quiet comfort. They had shared many conversations at this table over the years, some light, some heavy, but never one quite like this. It's over, Zoe said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I told him it's over. Margaret reached across the table, taking her daughter's hand in hers. I'm proud of you, Zoe. I know that wasn't easy. Zoe nodded, her eyes filled with unshed tears. I feel relieved, but also scared. I thought I knew what my life was going to be, and now it's all different. Margaret smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from Zoe's face. Different isn't always bad, sweetheart. Sometimes it's the first step toward something better. Zoe looked down at their intertwined hands, the strength of her mother's touch grounding her in this new, uncertain reality. I guess I just didn't realize how much I was letting him control everything. I thought I was making my own choices, but now, it's like I'm waking up. Margaret squeezed her hand. You are waking up. And you're stronger for it. You've learned what you need, what you deserve. That's something no one can take from you. For the first time in weeks, Zoe smiled, genuine and soft, a spark of hope flickering in her chest. I guess I didn't realize how much this house means to me too, she admitted, glancing around the room. I grew up here. I always thought of it as your house, but it's part of me too. Margaret's heart swelled, a bittersweet warmth spreading through her. It will always be your home, Zoe. No matter what happens, this place will always be a part of our family. Zoe nodded, her smile growing as she took in the familiar walls, the soft creak of the floorboards, and the gentle hum of life that had always existed within these walls. She had been so caught up in Dexter's vision of the future that she hadn't realized the beauty of what was right in front of her. As the days passed, Zoe began to rebuild her life, slowly and thoughtfully. She found a small apartment in town, a place that was entirely her own, and started taking steps to establish her independence. It wasn't easy, the echoes of her life with Dexter still lingered, but with each day, she felt more like herself. Margaret watched her daughter with a mix of pride and relief. Zoe was finding her way again, and though the pain of her broken marriage was still fresh, she was moving forward. The distance from Dexter had given Zoe the clarity she needed, and their relationship, once strained by his influence, had begun to heal. One evening, months later, as the leaves began to turn and the air grew crisp with autumn, Zoe and Margaret sat together on the porch, sipping tea as the sun set over the garden. "Mom," Zoe said, her voice soft in the quiet of the evening. "Thank you. For everything." Margaret smiled, her heart full. "You don't need to thank me, Zoe. You found your strength on your own. I'm just glad I could be here for you." Zoe leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, the peace of the moment settling around them like a warm blanket. "I didn't see it before, how much I was losing myself. But now, I feel like I'm finally becoming who I'm supposed to be. And I couldn't have done that without you." Margaret stroked her daughter's hair, her own heart lightened by the peace Zoe had found. "You've always been strong, Zoe. It just took a little while for you to see it." They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, the bond between them stronger than it had ever been. The house, their home, stood tall and proud behind them, a testament to the strength of their family and the memories they had built within its walls. As the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Zoe looked up, a question on her mind. "Mom, do you think I'll ever find love again? Real love, like you and Dad had?" Margaret smiled gently, her eyes shining with love and wisdom. "I believe you will, Zoe. Real love isn't about control or plans, it's about trust, respect, and letting each other grow. And when you find it, you'll know. You deserve nothing less." Zoe smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in months. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of the future. She was ready for it. And as the night settled around them, Margaret knew that the house, her beloved home, had once again done what it was meant to do. It had protected, nurtured, and healed the people she loved. The battles had been fought, the scars left behind, but in the end, love had won. And in that victory, both Margaret and Zoe found peace. The end.